For a long time, I used to think you needed months of dating to really understand someone's personality. I thought you had to see consistency over time, how they react, how they treat people, but psychology suggests something different. Most people actually reveal important personality patterns within the first hour of a date, if you know what signals to look for. In this video, I'm going to show you 5 personality types you can often spot within the first hour of meeting someone. And honestly, I wish I understood this earlier. It would have saved me time and a few bad dating decisions. Pay special attention to the first and the last type, because those two often make the biggest difference in who you choose to trust. Let's start with the first personality type. The first personality type you might notice within the first hour of a date is the narcissistic personality. And this one can be very hard to detect at first, because it doesn't always look negative. Sometimes it actually looks like confidence. For example, early in the conversation, you might notice they talk a lot about their achievements, their work, their lifestyle, or the things they've accomplished, not necessarily in an obvious bragging way, but in a way that keeps bringing the focus back to them. You might notice something else too. When you share something about yourself, the conversation somehow comes back to their story. You say something small about your experience, and suddenly they have a bigger story, a more impressive story, or a story that puts them back in the center. Another subtle sign is how they react to your opinions. Instead of curiosity, you might notice correction. Instead of asking more, they might explain more. And sometimes, you may notice they don't ask many questions about you unless it helps them continue talking about themselves. Now here's the important part. This doesn't always mean someone is a narcissist, but psychology shows that people with narcissistic traits often try to establish status early in interactions. They try to position themselves as high value, successful, or impressive, because first impressions matter a lot to them. The key signal to watch for is balance. Healthy confidence still leaves space for you. Narcissistic confidence often slowly removes that space, and by the end of the conversation, you might notice something interesting. You know a lot about them, but they don't really know much about you. That is often the first psychological clue. The second personality type you might notice within the first hour is the perfectionist. And this one is much quieter than the first type. Perfectionists usually don't try to impress you emotionally, they try to impress you through control. You might notice it in small details, how they chose the place, how they talk about their schedule, how organized their life sounds. Sometimes they might mention how busy they are, how productive they are, or how they don't like wasting time. Another subtle signal shows up when things don't go exactly as planned. Maybe the place is crowded. Maybe the order is wrong. Maybe something small changes. Most people adjust quickly. Perfectionists often show a small tension, not necessarily anger, but discomfort, because structure matters a lot to them. You might also notice how they describe other people. They may talk about people being irresponsible, unreliable, or not serious enough, which often reveals how high their internal standards are. Now again, this is not automatically negative. Perfectionists can be very reliable people, very committed, very consistent, but psychology shows perfectionism is often connected to control and anxiety. And the early signal to watch for is flexibility. Healthy perfectionists can relax when things change. Unhealthy perfectionists struggle when things are not ideal. And within the first hour, you can often notice how someone reacts when reality doesn't match their expectations. That reaction tells you much more than their words. The third personality type can actually feel very good at first, which is exactly why so many people miss it. Sometimes within the first hour, you might meet someone who seems unusually interested in you. They compliment you a lot. They might say things like "you're different," or "I feel like we really connect," and it can feel flattering, because attention always feels good. But psychology calls this pattern love bombing, when the intensity comes too fast. You might notice they agree with almost everything you say. They mirror your interests, they quickly create a feeling of similarity, and sometimes they may even start talking about future plans unusually early, not in an obvious way, but small comments like, "We should definitely do that together. You seem like someone I'd get along with long term." Another subtle signal is speed. The emotional pace feels fast, the connection feels strong, before enough time has passed to really know each other. Now here's the important distinction. Genuine interest grows naturally. Love bombing often feels accelerated, not fake, but rushed. Psychology suggests this sometimes happens because the person is trying to build emotional connection quickly, sometimes because of insecurity, sometimes because of control, and sometimes simply because they need validation. The key thing to watch is consistency. Do they stay curious about you? Or does the intensity fade once they feel they have your attention? Because real connection builds steadily. Artificial connection often builds quickly and then changes just as quickly. And that difference often starts showing within the first hour. The fourth personality type is almost the complete opposite of the last one, and sometimes it's even harder to recognize. Because instead of too much emotional energy, there's almost none. Within the first hour, you might notice the conversation feels slightly one-sided. Not because they're rude, but because they stay on the surface. You might notice they answer questions, but rarely expand. They might respond politely, but without emotional depth. Another subtle signal is how they react when conversations become slightly personal. They may change the subject, use humor, or give very short answers. Psychology often calls this emotional avoidance, and many emotionally unavailable people don't even realize they're doing it. Sometimes it comes from past experiences, sometimes from fear of vulnerability, and sometimes from simply being used to staying independent. One very interesting signal is curiosity. Emotionally available people usually show interest in your inner world. Emotionally unavailable people often stay in safe topics, work, hobbies, general conversation, but rarely feelings. The key thing to notice is emotional risk. Do they take any, or do they stay completely safe? Because within the first hour, most people show how comfortable they are with emotional openness, not through what they say, but through what they avoid saying. And that silence often tells you more than their words. Now, the fifth personality type might actually be the most important one to recognize, because while the other types can warn you about potential problems, this one often shows you potential for something healthy. Psychology often describes this as emotional intelligence. And interestingly, it doesn't usually show up through impressive words. It shows up through behavior. Within the first hour, you might notice something very simple. They actually listen, not just waiting to talk, but listening to understand. You might notice they ask questions that show they were paying attention. They remember small details. They don't interrupt your thoughts. Another subtle sign is how safe the conversation feels. You don't feel judged. You don't feel rushed. You don't feel like you need to impress them. And one of the biggest signals is balance. They share about themselves, but they also make space for you. They show confidence, but not dominance, interest, but not intensity. Psychology shows emotionally intelligent people tend to regulate the emotional pace of conversations. They don't rush connection, and they don't avoid it either. They let it develop naturally. And one of the strongest signals often appears when something small goes wrong, a delay, an awkward moment, a misunderstanding. Instead of reacting emotionally, they respond calmly. Because emotional intelligence is not about being perfect. It's about being aware. And often within the first hour, you can feel the difference between someone trying to impress you and someone simply trying to understand you. And that difference often tells you everything. So the next time you meet someone for the first time, remember this. You probably won't know everything about them, but if you pay attention, you might notice small personality signals much earlier than you expect. not to judge people, but to understand patterns, because sometimes the biggest mistakes in dating don't happen because we ignore big red flags. They happen because we ignore small psychological signals. Now, I'm curious about your experience. Which one of these personality types have you noticed the most when meeting someone for the first time? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to go even deeper into dating psychology, I also analyzed real dating profiles and the hidden red flags people miss there. You can watch that video next. It might completely change how you look at dating profiles.